The boys are back in town. The boys are back in town. Boys are back in town. Welcome back to the channel. I promise I will likely not be singing anymore to you in your poor ears. But I am going to be talking about Nicholas Eames's Kings of the Wyld, which I read recently and was pleasantly surprised by just how fun and engaging this story was. I wouldn't say that I quite loved it, but it was a breath of fresh air after reading so much epic fantasy, gigantic Stormlight novels, 1100, 1200, 1300 page books. This kind of solidifies that you can tell a fantastic, almost standalone story, because this is very much a quest of a storyline. You can tell a standalone story in around 500 to 600 pages. You don't have to blow it up with a million different things. So in that regard, I loved it simply because of the fact that it was refreshing between this and like Fires of Vengeance to just read a nice, concise storyline that was shorter. It wasn't blown up with 400 additional pages that may or may not be necessary. It's to the point. It was fun. Let's get into it. So for those of you that do not know what this book is, I'm a little bit later to most getting to it, but after hearing so many people in kind of like my circle, as I'm calling it, speak very highly of this book, I had to give it a shot, and it climbed right up my TBR, especially given my patrons who voted this and The Forgetting Moon as my two Howler reads of this month, which if you don't know what that is the top tier Patreon picks that we do every other month. So this and The Forgetting Moon tied, so this I read, and I will be reading The Forgetting Moon here shortly. So what this book is right up front, so basic plot, it's pretty straightforward. This is Nicholas Eames's debut novel, and he really wanted to tell what seems like a D&D campaign, traditional RPG style story with lots and lots of old school high fantasy elements, creatures, spells, you name it, all mixed in kind of this glove of a rock group getting back together for one last tour. Now, I didn't know exactly what to expect going into it with the musical references, things like that, because to me, no one could really explain what that meant. Obviously, they're like the boys are back in town is kind of like the slogan for this book. You hear a lot of people talk about 70s and 80s music being all over the place. I didn't know what to expect. I was kind of thinking, okay, how are you going to blend that in without being totally ridiculous? So right up front, before I jump into the plot, let me explain briefly what that is to the best of my ability. So essentially, you follow a band of characters, or they're mercenaries. So a group, they're considered a band because here's where these references come in. Their group is called Saga, and they are a band of mercenaries who, in their prime, were like the cream of the crop. They were the headliners. Everybody wanted to see them fight monsters. Like, they were the shit, right? Now, it is way beyond when they were relevant. They're all old and fat and drunk, and one of their daughters, Rose, is essentially under siege because she has also become a warrior. She is being sieged at this city, and they need to go save her and everybody else that's there, kind of break the siege. That is the basic plot. You have a group of characters that get together, you go on the quest to save Rose and free the city. Very simple, but it's done incredibly well. And the way that the music is kind of rolled into this is, so again, right off the bat, you have a band of characters. In a lot of the dialogue, when they're talking, you will have names of characters or places that are very obvious or subtle references to musical groups or artists of, the past, or whether it be a song or the person themselves. For example, the one that I actually tweeted about that I laughed out loud when I read it was there is a character that they're talking about at one point in the book named Elvis. It's Elvis, and they're making they're making a bunch of puns about him dying on the crapper, and that was like the most obvious one that I could think of. There are much more subtle ones where like if you aren't really paying attention, you're probably not even going to notice it. But there's things like when they go to get like a quest to go on, or go hunt some bandits, or hunt some kind of monster that needs to be killed. They talk about like, oh, well, how was your time, doing solo gigs? We used to be headliners. Now we're kind of like looked down upon. They talk about the crowds that they would get, bringing all these people that want to come see them. So it's basically as if they were the most famous rock group that existed at the time. And the way that you would talk about that group is the way that you talk about this, just in a fantasy setting. So it's not beating you over the head necessarily with rock references. It's a little bit more subtle than that. And if you actually read the extras in the back of the book, Nick Eames talks about how some of the main characters, like Ganelon, uses an axe, which is essentially a reference to a guitar. Matrick uses, he basically dual wields knives or drumsticks. There's a lot of just kind of like slaying references or like shredding. There's a lot of subtle musical references here and there to kind of describe what's going on. So it was actually a lot of fun and enjoyable. I could definitely understand why that would pull some people out of it, but this was basically, and I don't mean this as an insult, this was like a popcorn flick or just like a fun adventure to go on, because I grew up playing a lot of RPGs, isometric RPGs specifically, whether that be based on D&D, based on Pathfinder, things like Baldur's Gate, which is obviously based on D&D, Pathfinder is based on Pathfinder, all of these just traditional high fantasy settings, pretty simple plot lines. You're going to kill the bad guy, you're going to defeat the bandits, you have, your mage, your wizard, your tank, your DPS, your heals. That is essentially the makeup of this band of characters, but they're all hilarious and unique in their own right. And that was refreshing to read because, again, this is a pretty short book, but the characters are a lot of fun to follow, especially, Slowhand, is the one that everybody knows about. He's Clay Cooper. He's kind of like the lead. Everybody talks him up like, oh, I remember when you were the shit, and now you're this washed up old man. You have Moog, who's their wizard or mage, whichever you prefer to call him, and he is just a riot. Every time he is on the page, he's cracking jokes, he's making people laugh. He was honestly hilarious and says some pretty wild shit. What this book did really well, and I joked about this with some people in Discord, was it honestly, because I have such a heavy gaming background, that's where my head went. I know all about D&D. I've never really been a D&D player, but as much as people talk about that, I pulled from the video game aspect of this, where this book very much reminds me of where you're given your main quest right up front, go save Rose. Like, Rose is the daughter of this guy, you have to go save her and free the city. There's your main quest. And then along the way, things happen, you get pulled into side quests, you get derailed, and then you're just like, oh yeah, we have to finish the main quest. So that brought me a lot of joy reading this book, and which is why I enjoyed it so much, was just, it felt comforting to me to read something like this. And Nicholas Eames does not pull any punches when it comes to the level of absurd, over-the-top shenanigans that people get into, the combat, the gigantic, fireworks of a finale that this book ends on, and of course just pulling everything out from high fantasy lore, D&D, you name it, fantasy creatures, characters, themes, just all kinds of shit thrown at you. Harpies, owl bears, goblins, imps, like every fantasy creature, ogres, cyclops, like you'll see all kinds of crap in this. And it's just really cool to see a book structured this way that really embraces that old high fantasy D&D style of storytelling and simplicity almost. And it was beautiful in how simple it was. So obviously, from like a world building perspective, no, you're not getting Roshar. No, you're not getting Middle Earth. This is very much just like, okay, here's your setting, here's your quest, let's go have some fun. And that, to me, was very refreshing to read. And why you constantly hear about how fun and funny this book is, because it doesn't really take itself that seriously. Now, that's not to say that he can't have serious moments, because this book absolutely does. Like, it can pull at your heartstrings at times. Nicholas Eames knocked it out of the park from a prose perspective and storytelling perspective, which is incredibly surprising and admirable for a debut novel. This reads so smooth. The dialogue is great. The characters are lovable. The majority of them are pretty funny. Some of the things that happen are just absolutely hilarious. Definitely a solid read, and I'm interested to see what follows, because like I said, this to me kind of feels like a very much a standalone story. There is currently a sequel, Bloody Rose, which I have not read yet. I plan on definitely getting to that at some point, but this very much felt like a solid standalone, and if that's all it was, I would be perfectly satisfied with this, because for once you're not getting into this where, you know, these people are becoming the band. They're not becoming Saga. Like, they were already the shit back in the day. They were the lead performers. They've already kind of conquered the Wyld, but now you have them kind of getting it back together for one last ride. And that was super cool to see, just like a band of old men fighting, and you're in combat and people are saying, oh, I'm not as fast as I used to be, or like, I wouldn't have missed that back in my prime. So that was just really enjoyable to see older characters having to fight in a fantasy setting, and not just a bunch of 20-year-olds with, you know, unbeatable powers and magic and just destroying everything. So that was really entertaining. Even in the small page count that's here, some of the villains were entertaining. Larkspur was very vicious and sort of maniacal and manipulative, and she was really enjoyable. Last Leaf is a pretty well-rounded character, and again, Nicholas Eames talks about him in the back of the book, where you almost sort of feel for his plight and struggle in this condensed page count of why he's doing the things that he's doing. So honestly, just this book kind of knocks it out of the park in most aspects of a debut novel. I don't really have that many negatives to it. Like I said, I mean, honestly, talking about it, I like it more than even when I initially wrote some thoughts about it or talked to people about it. But this book was a lot of fun. I definitely highly recommend this. I will be reading the sequel sometime in the near future. Please let me know in the comments down below if you've read Kings of the Wyld or even Bloody Rose, and what you thought about the sequel, if it holds up to what was in this one, and if you're looking forward to more Nicholas Eames writing, because I certainly am. So that's going to do it for this review, though. Like and subscribe. As always, do hit up the Patreon if you want to support the channel. That is, of course, always optional, but always appreciated. Do jump in Discord or leave me a comment down below, though, and let me know your thoughts on Kings of the Wyld, Bloody Rose, and the band Saga. Who's your favorite member if you have read this? Mine would probably be Moog, just because he's absolutely hilarious. Otherwise, Clay, because he's probably the most well-rounded. That's also Slowhand, if you've heard that term. He's probably the most well-rounded character of the group because he's kind of the lead. But until next time, everybody, keep reading.